In 1856, in the remote hills of colonial Jamaica, a former slave named Samuel Sharp, Jr. did something that made even the hardest plantation owners stop and stare. He married 6 sisters in a single ceremony under the light of a full moon. The colonial newspapers called it savagery, the churches called it sin, and the British authorities called it proof that freed blacks needed civilizing. But what none of them knew was that Samuel wasn't building a family. He was building an army. And those 6 women weren't brides. They were generals in a war that history deliberately chose to forget. The year was 1856, 12 years after Britain had supposedly abolished slavery in its Caribbean colonies. But freedom on paper meant nothing when you still couldn't own land, couldn't vote, couldn't testify against a white man in court, and could be arrested for vagrancy if you refused plantation work at starvation wages. The hills of Trelawney Parish in western Jamaica had become a refuge for those who'd escaped the plantations, communities of maroons and freed people who remembered the old ways, the African ways, the ways that had kept them alive through 2 centuries of hell. Samuel Sharp, Jr. was named after his father, the legendary Baptist preacher who'd led the Great Slave Rebellion of 1831, the uprising that terrified the British Empire so badly they executed over 300 people, and finally, reluctantly, began the process of ending slavery. His father had been hanged in Montego Bay Square, and young Samuel had watched from his mother's arms. He was 3 years old. That image never left him. Neither did his father's final words, shouted from the gallows, "I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live in slavery." Now, at 32, Samuel had become what his father was, a leader, a healer, an Obeah man who understood both the spiritual power of their ancestors and the brutal political reality of British colonial rule. He'd studied with the old Akan priests, who still remembered the kingdoms of West Africa, learned plant medicine from Taino descendants who'd survived the Spanish genocide, and taught himself to read and write by stealing books from the ruins of burnt plantation houses. He knew something was happening, something the British were doing in secret, because the strongest voices of resistance kept disappearing. In just 2 years, 14 of the most influential leaders in the free black communities had died. Not from violence. That would have been too obvious, too likely to spark rebellion. They died from mysterious fevers, from seizures, from their bodies simply shutting down. The colonial doctors shrugged and wrote "tropical disease" on death certificates. But Samuel noticed what others didn't. Every single man had attended a meeting with the Colonial Land Commission in Kingston before they fell ill. Every single one had been pushing for freed blacks to receive the farmland they'd been promised. And every single one had signed documents with their thumbprint in the presence of British officials. That's when the DaCosta sisters came to him. There were 6 of them, daughters of a mixed-race merchant who'd made the mistake of becoming too successful, too vocal about property rights for freed people. Their father, Marcus DaCosta, had owned a profitable coffee farm and had helped other freed families purchase land through complicated legal arrangements that navigated around the discriminatory laws. He'd been found dead in his study 3 months earlier, his body twisted in agony, his skin an unnatural shade of gray. The British magistrate had ruled it a heart attack and promptly seized the farm as unclaimed property, selling it to a white plantation owner within the week. The eldest sister, Abena, stood before Samuel in his hillside compound, with eyes that burned like her Ashanti grandmothers must have when she'd been stolen from the Gold Coast. She was 30, tall and regal, with the bearing of someone who refused to bow. Her 5 sisters stood behind her, Ama, Efua, Adwoa, Ya, and the youngest, Akosua, who was barely 16 but had her father's gift for numbers and patterns. Abena didn't waste words. She opened her father's journal and showed Samuel the last entry, written in shaking handwriting the night before he died. "The ink burns," Marcus had written. "Every time I sign their cursed documents, my hands burn. I think they're poisoning us. Not through food or water, through the very papers they force us to touch. God help us, they've found a way to kill us with our own signatures." Samuel read the words twice, his blood turning cold. It was brilliant in its cruelty. The British knew that most freed blacks couldn't read or write, so all official documents required a thumbprint instead of a signature. And if that ink carried poison, if it was designed to absorb slowly through the skin with each repeated exposure, it would be the perfect murder weapon. Untraceable, deniable, genocidal. Abena explained what her sisters had discovered in the weeks since their father's death. Amma, who'd worked as a seamstress for colonial wives, had access to their gossip and had heard about a special ink formula shipped from London, something that discouraged the natives from making frivolous legal claims. Efua, trained in midwifery, had examined the bodies of 3 of the dead men and found the same symptoms their father had shown: nerve damage, organ failure, metallic residue under their fingernails. Adwoa, who'd learned herbalism from her grandmother, recognized the signs of heavy metal poisoning. Ya had connections to the dock workers and had seen crates marked "Colonial Administration, handle with gloves," being delivered to the Kingston offices. And young Akosua had created a map showing that every death clustered around parishes where land disputes were most active. They had the evidence, but they had no power. No white court would listen to the accusations of free black women against the colonial government. No British newspaper would publish their findings. They couldn't even gather publicly to discuss it without risking arrest under the new anti-conspiracy laws designed to prevent another rebellion. They needed protection, they needed resources, and they needed a way to work together that the British wouldn't immediately crush. That's when Abena proposed something audacious. In traditional Akan culture, a man could take multiple wives, and each wife brought her skills and lineage to strengthen the family compound. The British hated the practice, called it uncivilized, but they'd been forced to legally recognize customary marriages under pressure from maroon communities who'd negotiated their freedom. If Samuel married all 6 sisters, they could legally live together as one household. They could pool their resources, their knowledge, their networks. They could operate in plain sight, while the British sneered at their primitive polygamy and never suspected they were running an underground resistance laboratory. Samuel understood immediately. The marriage wouldn't be about love or desire. It would be a political alliance, a strategic formation disguised as scandal. The British would be so busy being outraged by the immorality of it that they'd never investigate what was actually happening inside the compound. Colonial racism would become their invisibility cloak. The wedding ceremony took place on a Thursday night, under the full moon, according to the old traditions. Nearly 200 people from the free communities gathered on Samuel's land, which sat high enough in the hills that they could see anyone approaching from miles away. The elders performed the rites in Akan, binding Samuel to each sister with words and rituals that predated the Middle Passage. The British authorities learned about it the next day, and were predictably scandalized. The colonial newspaper ran a horrified editorial about the degradation of the Negro race and the necessity of Christian education. The local magistrate muttered about finding legal grounds to prosecute, but ultimately couldn't. Customary law protected them. And so the real work began. The compound transformed into something unprecedented. To outsiders, it looked like a typical large family household. Women cooking, cleaning, tending gardens, raising children from Abena's previous marriage, while Samuel worked as a healer and spiritual guide. But behind closed doors, they were conducting scientific investigation that would have impressed European chemists. Abena, the strategist, coordinated everything and maintained contact with resistance networks across the island. Amma used her sewing work as a cover to visit colonial homes, where she carefully collected samples of documents, inks, and papers. Efua examined anyone who showed early symptoms, documenting everything meticulously. Adwoa turned part of the compound into a hidden laboratory, testing plants and minerals for antidote properties. Ya worked the information networks, tracking shipments and payments, and connecting dots. And Akosua, the brilliant youngest sister, created an elaborate coding system so they could document their findings in a way that looked like household inventory and family records. Within 6 months, they'd confirmed it. The ink used in colonial land offices contained arsenic trioxide, carefully formulated to absorb through skin contact. The concentration was precise, low enough that a single exposure wouldn't kill, but high enough that repeated contact over weeks or months would accumulate in the body until organs began to fail. It was sophisticated, deliberate murder disguised as bureaucracy. But confirmation was only the first step. They needed to save lives, and they needed to do it without alerting the British to what they'd discovered. Adwoa worked tirelessly in her hidden laboratory, testing hundreds of plant combinations. She knew from her grandmother's teaching that certain plants could bind to heavy metals and help the body expel them. After months of careful experimentation, she created a tincture made from soursop leaves, cilantro, garlic, and a rare fern that grew only in the deepest parts of the mountains. When tested on chickens deliberately exposed to the poisoned ink, the results were miraculous. The birds recovered. They began distributing the remedy disguised as a general health tonic, spreading the word through trusted networks that everyone should take it before and after any interaction with colonial officials. Samuel, as a known healer, could sell herbal medicines without suspicion. The sisters created coded messages in the patterns of Amma's embroidery work, warning specific communities when British land commissioners were coming to their areas. Ya established a warning system through the markets, using specific arrangements of fruits and vegetables to signal danger. The death rate plummeted. Over the next year, not a single resistance leader died under mysterious circumstances. The British noticed but couldn't understand why. They increased the concentration of arsenic in the ink, but Adwoa adjusted her antidote formula accordingly. They tried switching to different poisons, but Efua's medical examinations always identified the symptoms early enough for treatment. It was an invisible war, fought with plants and chemistry and the kind of systematic brilliance that colonial powers insisted black people were incapable of. But success brought danger. In early 1858, a colonial official named Henry Whitmore became obsessed with understanding why the troublesome natives had suddenly stopped dying. He was a cruel man who'd made a fortune from confiscated black-owned properties, and he needed the resistance leaders dead to continue his land grab scheme. He began investigating, and his attention eventually turned to Samuel's compound. The scandalous polygamous marriage, the constant stream of visitors, the suspicious good health of everyone connected to the household, it all seemed too convenient. Whitmore ordered a raid. British soldiers surrounded the compound at dawn, smashing through doors, tearing apart rooms, looking for evidence of rebellion or conspiracy. They found Adwoa's laboratory. They found the coded records. They found samples of the poisoned ink and the antidote formulas. Whitmore was triumphant. He had them arrested on charges of witchcraft, conspiracy to murder, and plotting rebellion. The penalty for any of these charges was death by hanging. The trial was held in Kingston, and it was a spectacle. The British wanted to make an example of Samuel and the sisters, to terrify any other freed blacks who might get ideas about resisting colonial authority. Whitmore presented the laboratory equipment as proof of occult practices. He presented the coded documents as evidence of conspiracy. He presented the antidote formulas as poisons intended to kill white colonists. The judge, a plantation owner himself, seemed ready to sign the death warrants before the defense even spoke. But Samuel and the sisters had one advantage the British hadn't anticipated. There were black lawyers now, freed men who'd educated themselves in British law and used that knowledge as a weapon. A young attorney named James Morrison took their case, and he was fearless. He stood before that hostile courtroom and did something radical. He told the truth. Morrison presented Marcus DaCosta's journal. He brought forward the families of the 14 dead resistance leaders and made them testify about the pattern of deaths. He produced the chickens Adwoa had used in her experiments, showing how the animals exposed to colonial office ink died without treatment, but survived with the herbal remedy. And then, in a moment of devastating theater, he brought out bottles of the actual ink used in colonial land offices and demanded that Judge Harrison sign a document using it without gloves. The courtroom went silent. Judge Harrison refused. Morrison pressed harder. If the ink is harmless, surely His Honor wouldn't object to demonstrating that fact. The judge grew red-faced, blustering about the impropriety of the request. Morrison then revealed his final piece of evidence. He'd obtained shipping records showing that the special ink was manufactured by a chemical company in London that explicitly advertised its products for pest control and poisoning. The same company supplied arsenic to rat catchers. Whitmore tried to have Morrison arrested for contempt. The gallery erupted in chaos, and in that chaos, something unprecedented happened. 3 white merchants who'd witnessed the trial stood up and corroborated the story. They'd lost black business partners to the mysterious illness. They'd wondered about the deaths. They'd suspected, but been too afraid to speak. Now, with the evidence laid bare and the conspiracy exposed, their silence felt like cowardice. The British Empire had a decision to make. They could execute Samuel and the sisters and turn them into martyrs, igniting the very rebellion they feared. Or they could make the problem disappear. The judge dismissed all charges for lack of credible evidence. The court sealed all documents related to the case. Whitmore was quietly transferred to India. The formula for the colonial office ink was changed within a month, and officially, none of it had ever happened. Samuel and the sisters walked free, but they understood the unspoken threat. They'd won this battle by exposing the British publicly, and the British had let them live only because killing them now would confirm everything. But they would be watched. Any future resistance would be crushed mercilessly. They made a choice then that ensured their story would survive, even if they didn't. Young Akosua, the brilliant mathematician, had memorized everything. Every formula, every name, every date, every death. She coded it all into what appeared to be a family Bible, using a cipher based on traditional Akan numerical systems. That Bible was passed down through generations, hidden in plain sight, waiting for a time when the truth could be told without immediate execution. Samuel died in 1889, still married to all 6 sisters, having trained dozens of young people in the arts of resistance, medicine, and survival. The sisters outlived him by years, each continuing the work in her own way. When the last sister, Akosua, died in 1921 at the age of 81, she left the Bible to her granddaughter with simple instructions. When they can no longer kill us for remembering, remember everything. That time came in 1962, when Jamaica won its independence. The coded Bible was finally translated by Akosua's great-grandson, a chemistry professor at the University of the West Indies. He published the findings in an academic journal, expecting perhaps a footnote in history. Instead, he discovered that the British colonial arsenic program hadn't been limited to Jamaica. Similar patterns of mysterious deaths among land rights activists had occurred in Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, and India during the same period. The Poison Ink program had been empire-wide, a systematic genocide hidden in bureaucracy, killing thousands. The revelation should have shaken the world. It should have demanded apologies, reparations, justice. But by 1962, the British Empire was busy rebranding itself, celebrating its peaceful transition to a commonwealth of equals, insisting that whatever wrongs had been done were the excesses of a few bad individuals, not systematic policy. The report was acknowledged, briefly discussed, and then quietly buried under more pressing contemporary concerns. But here's what they couldn't bury: the legacy of resistance. Samuel and the Six Sisters proved that the most powerful act of rebellion isn't always the loudest. Sometimes it's the quiet work of turning your oppressors' weapons against them, of using their prejudices as camouflage, of saving lives they meant to take. They proved that when systems try to erase you, the greatest victory is simply to survive, to remember, and to make sure that one day someone tells the truth. The British saw 6 wives and called it primitive. They should have seen 6 scientists and called it what it was: genius wrapped in ceremony, revolution disguised as scandal, the future hiding in plain sight, while the past tried desperately to kill it. Today, in the hills of Trelawney Parish, there's a small monument that wasn't erected by any government. The descendants of those free communities built it themselves, carved from Jamaican limestone, listing names that official history never bothered to record. At the top, Samuel Sharp Jr. and the 6 Sisters of Resistance. Below that, 14 names of men who died from poisoned ink. And at the bottom, a single line in both English and Akan: "They tried to kill us with our own fingerprints. We survived with our own hands." That's the lesson. That's what they want you to forget. That black brilliance has always existed. That black resistance has always been strategic and scientific and successful. And that the only thing more threatening to colonial power than rebellion is the kind of genius that makes rebellion unnecessary because it saves the people you were trying to kill. Remember their names. Remember the truth, because they survived so that you could know.